I'm joined now by Greg Cantwell. Greg Cantwell is the CEO of Peer Support Australia. Peer Support, he's been in that role for 6 years. He has a background of public health and education. Peer Support Australia provides essential support to particularly Australian schools to look at positive impact of wellbeing in children and young people. Greg's here to have a discussion with me about peer support, positive relationships, agency, sense of responsibility and self and others. So lots to talk about. I think Greg and I could be here for a while, but we'll keep it contained. One of the things that I've observed is the value of people connecting with each other with the same lived experience and sharing that disease, sharing the conditions or sharing a similar life experience can add so much value in how you sort of manage that and live with it every day. So tell us a bit, Greg, about what you do at Peer Support Australia.
Thanks, Jodie. It's really great to be here. It's sort of reflecting, it's probably some 18 months since we've been allowed outside to do these sorts of things, so I'm really pleased that we could be here today. I guess if I can, I'd like to start with sort of telling a bit of a story about how we came to be, because in a way it sort of describes all the laundry list of things that you'd like to get through. So 50 years ago today, I've probably added the today bit to give a dramatic effect, but certainly 50 years ago this year, Peer Support Australia actually came into being. And it's not what you might think. So what happened was there was a group of high school students and there was a tragic event. So the local drug and alcohol education worker went back into the school as she had done many, many times. But this time she was struck by something was different. So she realised that one of the reasons that the tragic event occurred wasn't because of lack of information. Was it because the way they communicated wasn't getting through? And in a brief time, she started to dispel that idea, but realised what it was a lack of connectedness within the school. So this student OD'd, and that was a result of not feeling connected in with the school community. And so that began her life's work about saying, how do we build better connectedness? Students been connecting with each other better, because knowledge itself doesn't change things. It's about how we do it, and it's about the relationships that we have. And if I could be self-indulgent and just tell one more story. Connecting and connectedness is really very simple. And it's at its core, I think, it's around hospitality. And it happened to me this morning when I arrived here. So one of the first things that I was given, which was a heartily welcome, which was really lovely. I had a name tag that had my name on it, so I felt welcomed and I was supposed to be here. And then a nice steaming cup of coffee was thrust into my hand, and I can say was very welcomed after my trip here. So it was that sense of, I felt like I should be here. And that sense of feeling welcomed is really important about relationships and connecting. And so it sort of comes around really nicely to this is what we're going to talk about today. One of the things when you start to talk about peer support is it's that catch-all phrase. It means lots of things to many people. In fact, I think when I did a quick Google search the other day, there's 268 million references on Google alone. And so I had a bit of a conversation and tried to get this to work, and I said to some people, so tell me, what does peer support work? And you can already see there's a whole different array of different words that came up. It means connecting, it means support, mentoring, buddy programs, lived experience. What else can I read? Leadership, influencing others, all those sorts of things. So peer support is this catch-all phrase in a way. The way I'd like to see it is it's actually the vehicle in which we achieve an outcome. So it is the method rather than something you do in of itself. But rather than a whole group of words that are just there on the screen, I probably should get a little bit more scientific than that. And so this came from a group of far more eminent researchers than I possibly could be, that basically describes peer support as this catch-all phrase, as an umbrella term that takes in all these sorts of programs. So things like peer mentoring, peer relationships, peer counselling, peer consulting, peer coaching, etc., etc. So curiously, when you look at all those things, because they're quite diverse, we can say that it basically distills itself down to, distills itself down to these three common areas. So it's about supporting each other. It's actually planned and structured. So to have a successful peer support experience, it's not ad hoc. It has to be something that is quite structured. And I think, and as part of that, people need to be trained within their role. And what's not there, but I think it should be there, is that it's reciprocal. So it's for people sitting on both sides of the chair, that each of us gets something from a peer relationship. So I guess, in a way, that kind of sums up what we do and the sort of things that we're part of. But of course, things can go wrong. And so just a word of caution is that we know that peer support in of itself is not the magic bullet, that if you have a poorly constructed peer support program or peer support anything really, if it's not done well, at best there is no advantage to it. At worst, it can actually do damage.
You mentioned successful.
Yep.
A successful peer support. And so I guess we've sort of transitioned from this concept of support groups, that ad hoc thing, to peer support. How do you define success? What's a successful sort of peer support? And if someone came searching for that, for instance, to MSL and their peer groups, what do you think they'd be looking for and what can they expect to get out of a successful peer group?
That's a really broad question, I think, Jodie, in lots of ways. So let's get into the meat really quickly. So firstly and foremost, as we sort of touched on, it's not that something that happens by magic. It's something that requires an investment both in time and energy from organisations and indeed from those who are participating in the peer support experience. So it's about investing. I think it's also about so what people should be looking for is something that is well supported, that has the support that sits behind it. So you touched on the value of lived experience, and indeed that sense of, it provides within a peer support context almost a shorthand. I don't kind of need to explain myself because someone else has been there too, and so there's great value in that. But I guess there's a little bit of just something that would sit in the back of my mind is that my lived experience is not necessarily somebody else's lived experience. So I think that's where the richness is it because it means that whilst we have some shared experiences, it's very much about that, how do we journey together to receive the support that we need. There is actually a slide, but I won't go to it now. But for me, I think the way that you look at that outcome as a successful peer support program is that really what it is in my mind is it is about giving people the support, the skills, the strategies to better navigate life, whatever that might be, because my journey is different to your journey and everybody else's and everybody else's. Sadly, I wish I really could to get rid of all the bumps that you're going to have, but I can't do that. But it's really about giving people the skills to work through the times when things aren't great, to enjoy and celebrate when things are really brilliant. But I guess as most of it is really about there is someone who is walking alongside me as part of my journey. And I think that's the power that you get through a peer support program.
For sure. I know in the medical space they've kind of taken on some of that and talked about shared clinics, but that really captured, and my experience of that for people living with MS was really capturing that other people had exactly that, tips and tricks and hints about how they can understand what they're doing and how they can also get the support and resources that they need, because it's sort of, I know someone who knows someone who knows someone.
Yes.
And how valuable those connections are. One of those sort of things, if it's not what you know, it's who you know.
Yeah.
and so that's certainly some of the values in peer support. I'm going to touch a little bit on research and how and where the space, where peer support is in that space and what sort of outcomes research is looking at. Can you tell me a bit about that?
So a lot of recently we actually undertook some of our own research with Deakin University, and what was really reassuring, I guess, is that it validated a lot of what's happened beforehand. So the concept of peer support has been well researched and well established, and what it goes back to now is it's saying that a peer support experience just doesn't happen. a peer support experience, in order to reach the outcomes and in order for it not to do damage, needs to have all those things to it still. So it does need to be structured. You do need to have trained people running it. Now, when we say trained people, let's not overthink that. We work in the space of schools, so we literally train up 12-year-olds, 11-year-olds to be part of this. But importantly, it's not this thing of, in you go, just jump into a room and she'll be right. There's a thing of it needs to be structured. So if I may, is to explain how it works within primary school students, because I reckon if we can get primary school kids to do it, we can get anyone to do it. Maybe we should start to work on year 9 students, but maybe not.
Teenagers?
Yeah, maybe. We can do teenagers. So let's do teenagers. Better choice. So the way that our program works in schools, and we work outside of schools as well, but predominantly in schools, is that we train up year 10, well actually the year 9 students at the end of the year. Can't imagine anything more exciting, can you, than being in a room full of 15-year-olds at the end of the school year when they think the year's over. It's really exciting. So we train them up in the skills that they need to run a group. Now that's really critical, and about how you have a conversation of when to let something go and when to sort of say, hang on, I've got to rein that stuff in. So we train up the year 9s. The following year, they are then in year 10, they will be working with the students who are coming in, the year 7 students, and part of their role at the beginning of the year is to help them settle into school. So aid them with transition, because we know if the year 7s settle in well, then they're going to have good mental health outcomes, and it's going to be more likely to have good mental health outcomes and be a good experience for them. And so they then work with these year 7 students who are 11 and 12. So here we got 15, 16s working with 11 and 12-year-olds. There's a couple of critical components. They've been trained. The next part of that is the program that they are running has been written for them and with them, so that they are delivering something that is structured. So it's not just to sit around and let's have a chat. There's real value in that, and we should encourage that. And in fact, the research that we're getting from lots of kids is the problem with our lives is they're far too busy for us to simply sit down and have a chat. I think there's a take out there for all of us, for all those of us with parents, to say, let's give our kids some time just to be. I'll get off my soapbox. The next part of that, though, is critical. It's the preparation, but it's the debrief afterwards. So there needs to be that opportunity for the leader within that group to be able to go back and debrief. I think it's the same within every peer type relationship, is that there will usually, the way they run, is that there will be someone who will lead the group and help guide the direction in which it takes. There's great and important value in that person having a place to go to. So if we go back to lived experience, sometimes there is huge advantage in that, but sometimes when you've been told your story enough, there can be at times triggers and other things, and it's really important as organisations that we supply the resources to support people when maybe it's time for them to take a step back and be part of the peer support experience rather than be the peer support leader. So the research is bearing out all those things, because it says if we don't, what we end up with is maladaptive behaviours. So, we sit around and we moan and complain about how awful this place is. Isn't it dreadful? Oh, it wouldn't work here. Blah, blah, Darren hates me. All those sorts of things. But if we just continue to do that, we actually don't get anywhere. And that can be one of the problems with the peer support group, whereby there's not this sense of if we need to have these structures and these things in place, otherwise it just becomes this spiral where we sit around and moan and complain. And in fact, it's worse for us. Or the classic is saying, yeah, when I get a bit sad, I have a drink. No. So again, we've got to make sure that what we're doing is actually promoting good outcomes rather than letting it to see where it ends up and potentially ending up with poorer outcomes. And the research continually bears that out, which is great.
You mentioned there some of the dangers and referenced a couple there, but I guess when you're, particularly when you have a new diagnosis and really of a condition and really seeking that sort of lived experience, I just want someone who gets it, who gets what I is. So I'm going to kind of go to peer support, and that can have dangers. Can you just talk about that a little bit? Yeah,
and I think it's important to state that people, in my experience, always come from a good place. It's coming from a really good place. And I guess the classic example of that is reach out to someone and they start to share their experiences and they say, oh yeah, don't worry about doing that. They'll tell you you should eat better, but I haven't found it's done any good to me. I haven't found it's... And so I guess it's like all things, particularly when we newly diagnosed with anything, is to seek out information from a range of reputable sources, and here is clearly a good place, and see it through that lens, rather than saying, if I hear it from the person who has the lived experience, it may not be quite what I need to hear as well. I need to take in all the information, not just that. So I think it's important that people, particularly newly diagnosed, are encouraged to seek advice from reputable sources widely, and a part of that should be peer support, because they will give insights that, as you said, it's sometimes what you know, but it needs to be seen as, just because it's their journey doesn't mean it might be your journey, and indeed what they use to get through something might not actually work for you, and so that's important to take in other information too.
Yeah, so true, so true. And so how do you think, I mean, we've come away from COVID where I think we all have really started to see how incredibly important connectedness is. What about the future, do you think, in terms of peer supports, and where do you think the growth is going to be, the understanding? It's a big question.
Yes. So my thesis will begin now. Discuss. So COVID's been an interesting time. So you know, running a program, an organisation which does this, you know, lots of face-to-face, and encourages people to do so, because, you know, our position is saying, you know, there is a place for online peer support, but it's this as well that is really critical. So for us, it was a 180 turn about, well, how do we deliver something that is meaningful in an online presence? And so we did that, of course, because it was necessary and important at the time. But what we came back to was, it was actually some really simple things that we could put in place that builds a sense of connectedness and enhances relationships, which ultimately is, in a way, the name of the game in order to make better lives for ourselves. So one of the simple things that we actually did was we instigated a talk and walkathon. So we're all very cognizant of what a walkathon is, and indeed I think you've got a fun run or something on the weekend, don't you? So we added talk to that. So the idea behind it is really quite simple and straightforward, is as part of the walking is to do some talking. We introduced this with kids because you can do it at 1.5 metres apart because they talk very loudly, so that was really handy, but was to give them some cards to say, and group them together with groups of students who they might not normally know, and we had them walk together and ask each other some questions. Simple stuff. Do you have a pet? Where do you live? What sports do you play? And we're starting to build up this idea that there's a whole range of people within your school who you don't routinely connect with, but it's really important to do so. They'd then come to a station, and then they'd change and go off to the next group. And so over time, they started to build these networks throughout the school. That was really important, because as schools were staggering return times, it might have meant that they were actually back at school with a group of kids who they weren't friends with, who weren't part of their friendship group. And so what we wanted to do was to build up this sense of, I am connected with a whole lot of people, more than just my friendship group, which is critical and important, and I don't need to change that, but I need to be kind of connected to some others so I don't feel so isolated and I don't feel so alone. And so we, again, will continue to roll out the Talk and Walkathon, because we recognised that that was something that was really important for people to physically connect, even if they couldn't be in arm's reach of each other, and just sort of to talk their way through, because what we found was that our kids in particular liked, mostly, being at home a bit, but they missed that opportunity to have a chat. You know, as we said a little bit earlier, what they kept on telling us was, we don't just sit and talk, we want to do that too. And so there are things that we can do to build into our day-to-day that really promotes connecting through a peer support model.
Okay, well that sounds like something we could all take. I guess that designing programs that really are intentional.
Yes.
And have a really, this is what we want to achieve, and this is what we want to what we want to gain. And do you think that's important, that you understand your own intent when you're seeking a peer as well? Like when you're, say I was a person living with MS and thought I really want to connect with someone,
does it help define why and how you want to? And then what would be your tips about how you could go about it if you wanted to do that?
Yeah, sounds like we're designing a matchmaking sort of organisation, Jodie.
Well, let's.
Swipe for your peer. We now own that concept. So it raises for me a few interesting questions. Sometimes the most delightful relationships aren't those that we've planned. And there's some lovely surprises in even meeting up with someone who at first blush you think, oh, I don't think we have much in common, or I don't particularly like. We probably all have stories about there was a teacher at school who we had terrible things about. The minute we got into their classroom, we're saying, actually, I really like this. And I wonder whether it's the same for us when we're looking for someone to have a relationship with in terms of peer support. Or conversely, we think, this is the person for me, they know what I mean, we have a similar diagnosis at a similar age, it's just going to be fantastic, and it's not. Does that make it even worse? So I guess my tips is for both parties to go in very much with that open mind of actually starting a conversation and seeing where it leads to, and recognising that there are some that are going to be really intense and probably beneficial at certain times, and there are others that are just going to be there, that play a role in supporting me, but at the same time, I might not go to them for when things are pretty dark or pretty rough. I'll go to somebody else who might be the only time I go to them. And conversely, people will come to me for different reasons too. And so I guess the greatest tip is say, be open to where it kind of ends up. There's no right or wrong relationship in that way, but also at the same time be prepared to say, look, I actually don't think that's kind of working too. We don't kind of line. Like every relationship, it's a little tricky.
Yeah. That reminds me of when I was reading a bit about resilience, as we all were in COVID.
Yes.
And that value of having a broad range of relationships, that a broad range of connections in with different people, because not everyone is going to, or not one single person will meet all your needs. And it sounds like, from what you're saying, just curiosity is so important in establishing peer support group. Maybe perhaps more than being intentional about it, but just being curious about what people live with and what their lives is, because you never really know the whole story about that.
Indeed.
Now you had some slides, and did you want to go through more a bit about those slides?
Look, shall we see whether we can play a video?
Okay, let's
That's
have a look.
always fun on these sorts of things,
Yeah,
isn't it?
videos.
So, it goes for the briefest of times. Everyone's seen a blank screen. Let's see whether this works. And no sound. This is the Talk and Walkathon in action. Really simple, can be done anywhere, by anybody, really. Any group, any organisation, any school. Now, no.
I know our event coming up on the weekend is the walk, run, roll. So
Perfect.
It captures any way that you can do that. You can walk or run or roll.
Yep.
And we haven't added talk into it, but maybe the running and the talking might be a bit hard. But certainly that concept I get of just having that, bringing that natural curiosity to it, and then seeing what evolves out of that.
And I think too, as part of that, is to seek out people who you might not walk, run, roll with. So it's about broadening beyond just my group to sort of, as you said, we know from COVID the experience of having multiple different groups, there is some value in that. So I guess just where I really wanted to finish up was that, for Peer Support Australia, it's very much about creating the space, the support and the skills to better navigate life. And I guess I've got a couple of pictures up there, and I deliberately chose those because in terms of peer support, our patron is the Governor-General, and so he's sitting there as part of a group. He probably has few peers, admittedly, within who he works with, but here he is sitting down with a group of kids and was very much part of that group. And he was learning as much from them as they were from him. And so I think to sort of look outside the square a little bit in terms of who is it that I seek out, who I see as my peer group, because we tend too much to see that as my peer group will be somebody of my same age or of the same diagnosis, but rather than saying, actually, I'm a broader person than that. I'm more than my age, my gender, or my diagnosis. So likewise, seek out people a little bit broader than that, and who you can tap into and both support, and you support them and they support you as you work through your journey.
And one thing I guess that has also emerged quite commonly is when you're stuck in a negative group, and or how to work out when you get into a group or even a relationship. You know, are there any signs that you can look for or triggers, or how do you sort of exit that, or how do you know when it's being destructive as opposed to helpful?
Yeah, and look, it's the nature of groups sometimes, isn't it? And I guess firstly is to give yourself permission to leave. Is that it's actually okay that you don't need to stay and be part of that group, even if you've been there for a little while, and you actually, at first, it may be just what you need, but over time you're feeling like, actually, I'm not growing as part of this, and indeed, worse, you know, I'm sort of spiralling a little bit. So it's actually okay to leave a group. It's actually okay to go back to the coordinator and say, I just don't want to be part of that anymore. Maybe what the steps are is not to go as often and choose and start another group. In terms of the signs, I guess at its core is about, how do I feel about this, and am I getting something from this as much as am I giving something to this? Because there is, it's hard when you're part of a group that is energy taking rather than energy giving, and often the best indicator I think is when you walk away from the group and go, you know, whereas you should leave going, and you know, you think, oh, great, I got peer support on Tuesday, fantastic, rather than something that you kind of look forward to. So I think there's all those little cues about, you know, what makes up a good group for us. But I think at its core is say it's actually okay to walk away and try something else as well. You know, we're not indentured to a group, because that was, particularly I think for the first one, that you often feel like, maybe it's me, maybe this is how this whole thing works, but if it doesn't feel right, then seek out other alternatives, I reckon.
And what about the whole social media? It needs to be asked. And where you think that sort of fits in, and you know, Facebook groups and you know, we tend to kind of pigeonhole peer groups as this sort of little support groupy kind of concept, but in fact Facebook groups are and stuff. And how do you where do you see that fitting?
So the genie is well and truly out of the bottle. And so it's about how we manage that. So we work predominantly within the children and youth space, and our messaging would be one of very much saying it is one small tool, social media is one small tool that, particularly in the age of your children, that parents need to be part of and to monitor and manage, but there needs to be other things. We really value the conversation, and it needs to, if COVID taught us one thing, that video conferencing is not quite the same as sitting around a table. And I think it's the same for relationships, that having them online, having them via Facebook or whatever, it's not kind of the same as sitting in a room when you can. What is great about social media, I think, is it really can connect in, particularly kids who are a little isolated. So whether that's because of just who they are as people or even geographically. So there's great value to it. But we would, you know, we would be encouraging as best as we possibly can to say, really need to have the face-to-face sitting around, well, not around a table necessarily, but even side by side, you know, is the human interaction, there's a real value to that should be encouraged at all times. And we saw that as COVID, where kids wanted to get back to school, not to do any work, quite rightly, but to be with their mates. And that makes sense to us. I mean, we're social beings. And I think one of the messages that also came out of COVID was saying, I actually don't need to be everybody's friend as well. I need to be friendly, and I need to have connections with people. But maybe there's a group that are my special friends, a bit like we talked about a peer group. You know, these are my special friends, but I have others as well. But yeah, social media plays its role, but I think we need to encourage alternatives to that too.
I think people living with MS has even that one of the barriers can be the disease, also the treatments that, and we're going to talk a bit more about that later.
Yeah.
But so groups within the social media space have really evolved and been like many conditions. People want to connect with people overseas. People want to connect that. But I think there's a truth in that it can make you feel even more lonely, and it can make you feel even more isolated to be in that space. And really sort of that person's doing so amazingly and I'm not. And you don't get to see that person and go, they're not that amazing and they're not that fabulous and they're not doing that well. So I think, I guess it comes back again to
balance of having more than just one and lots of different sources of what we frame as peer groups are actually groups of your people around you for different reasons, for different things.
Indeed.
For sure. And just looking at outcomes in terms of longevity of peer groups as well too. You know, how do you see, particularly with school groups, do you find that it's a more short-term thing or long-term thing or a mixture?
So we started this gig 50 years ago, and there would be still some schools who've been doing this that are some 50 years later in some shape or form. So I think, as I said, I see peer support as very much the vehicle to achieve that outcome of giving people the skills to better navigate life. So I think there will always be a role and a place for peer support because there's something about it. There is something about connecting in with others, particularly when there is a little bit, there's something we share. And that's just, I think, who we are as humans. So I think as I look into the future, I think the future for peer support is really, really positive because I think the value that it adds to people's lives, particularly when things aren't going great or there's bit of news that they don't kind of like, it's invaluable. And so I'm, not surprisingly, but encourage organisations and schools and everybody to say, get in behind peer support because the research is really clear. It works when done well, and it's not that hard to do it well. So it's a no-brainer in my mind as why everyone's not doing a peer support program of some shape or form.
You don't often hear it works and it's not that hard.
Yeah, that's right.
So we're going to finish on that incredibly positive note of that it works and it's not that hard, because I think that's really valuable to everyone, for everyone to hear, because it is something that can really break down the barriers of connection. So thank you so much for coming
Pleasure.
and sharing your experience today, and you've really added value to how we think about peers and how we work out how to negotiate those relationships. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Jodie. We're clear.